Okay, today I want to talk to you guys about rotary blades. And so this program, this particular class, covers reel and mowing systems. Well, part of mowing systems is rotary blades. And I usually do rotary blades at the end of the class, but we'd like to use or demonstrate how to use our rotary blade grinder over there. And most of the people in this program are going to be dealing with rotary blades more than reel blades. And so I just want to cover that first, get it out of the way. That way we had that available throughout the whole quarter. And there's not a lot to rotary blades. It's not a super difficult topic. So it's just some things I wanted to point out before we go looking at that machine. And so the book that you'll get in your classroom, the Fully United book, in the back of the book, they have a section that covers rotary blades. It's only a couple of pages long. And they have a couple of tips that they cover on this page here. So you want to make sure that you always grind the blades similar to what the manufacturer ground it at. And there's a couple of things that the manufacturer is going to be doing to a blade that's important that you follow. So looking at this blade here is a factory ground blade. The features that we're going to be pointing out: when you grind a blade, you want to grind the same as the manufacturer. If the manufacturer ground this far, you want to grind that far. You don't want to grind it all the way across. So always kind of match what they do. You'll notice on the manufacturer's blade that here has a radius. One of the problems that we have is people use mechanical grinders and they put a square notch in there. And here's an example of a blade that I picked up from our maintenance department. And they were grinding all their blades this way. They had a machine set up where they would grind, so they were getting nice, perfect grinds, but they were leaving this square notch. And I actually had a couple blades that came clear back here and went across. So over half the blade was gone, and it was in a square corner. So I went through their whole rack and took almost half their blades off the rack and went and threw them in the trash can, scrap iron, and just didn't really tell them. Then I talked to them later about grinding a radius in their blades. So it's pretty common. I've actually seen people with hand grinders do that. And so be careful, never grind a square notch. Always have some sort of radius in there. And so if you have a square corner, that corner becomes an area where it will actually shatter. So you hit a hard rock, you hit a stick, you hit a rod sticking out of the ground, that's where it will crack, and then the blade may fly off and go through the side of the mower deck or go out the mower deck and hopefully not hit somebody, but it could actually hit somebody. So be very careful about how you grind it. The manufacturer put a radius, you want to put a radius. It's important to do that. So the valve grinder, not the valve grinder, but the real rotary blade grinder that we're going to be looking at, you'll notice that the stone has a very rounded edge on it. The rounded edge helps leave a rounded radius, so it's not square. You wouldn't actually put a stone on there and then polish it up or clean it up so it was square. If it was square, then it would create that corner. We don't want that corner. So that's the first thing. Second thing that I want to do is most manufacturers grind their blades at 30 degrees. The recommended rotary blade angle grind is 30 degrees. And so you want to make sure that you maintain 30 degrees. If you want to zoom in here, this is an example of a blade that's been worn. If you look and see, we got a rounded edge. The most common mistake that people do is they want to get done faster. If it's rounded, they just increase the angle, make it steeper, so that they grind it faster and get it down here to the square edge on the bottom. The important thing is the bottom has to be flat. You can never grind the bottom of a blade. It's very common for us to have a customer's mower come in, somebody reaches under there and grinds it, and they grind just like a knife. So you got a knife where it comes up on the bottom, comes up on the top. What's going to happen if I was to grind the bottom at an angle?
You would bruise the grass when the blade comes around.
So the grass is going to be cut wherever the point is. If the point is in the middle of the blade, it's going to cut the grass blade there, and everything below that is going to rub the grass. And I'm going to bruise the grass. And what's going to be the aftercut appearance with bruised grass? It's going to turn brown. Why is it brown? Because I've bruised and I've killed the tissue on whatever volume that we've been rubbing, because this blade's not going to cut and then walk away. It's spinning around, especially if you're not traveling very fast, and it constantly going around beating. It's the bruising, and then it bruises, that tissue dies. When that tissue dies, it has a yellow or a brown. It's really more of a yellow look. So if you go home and you look at your lawn and you mow it, a couple hours later it looks yellow, it's because your mower blade was dull. And if it's dull like this example down here, it's going to just tear the grass. Then that's going to bruise the grass as this rounded edge is just beating on the grass. As it beats on it, bruises it. A couple hours later, it's going to turn yellow. It looks really bad. So it's important that you keep a square edge as much as possible, and that the bottom edge is what cuts the grass. That way you cut the grass and then you let it go. When you put the blade on and you're adjusting your mower deck, if the mower deck is lower in the back than the front's going to cut, and then this whole part of the blade is going to bruise, and it's going to keep bruising until it gets back here, and this is going to drag, and it's going to try to cut it in the back. So instead of cutting the grass and discharging it, it's going to be trying to cut it and recirculate that grass throughout the whole deck. So it's going to screw up the way the deck is designed, and it's going to cause that bruising.
If your height is different in the back than the front, won't you have like little ridges all through your mowing stripes?
It will also leave a ridge if you're traveling pretty fast, because as it's cutting and cutting and cutting, the lowest point cuts very last, and it's going to move forward and cut again, and so you'll actually have little notches, yes, especially if it's really steep. So we'll talk more about that later, but I'm just trying to look at, you get that bruising effect, and it's rubbing. It takes a lot of horsepower when you're just rubbing. So why does it take more horsepower when you're like this? It's because most of the blade is rubbing. You get a final piece that's finally cutting. So the engine's just bogged in, and man, it's just not running very well. Yeah, it's because you're just dragging. So don't drag like that. So you want to make sure that it's cut. If it's dull, you've got to cut at a 30-degree angle all the way back until you get rid of everything that is round. And then you come back to a square edge. And you can see in this example, you would have to take off a lot of blade in order to get there. So you got to look at the cost of the blade and the cost of what your time is to sharpen the blade. So when you ask, well, is it worth sharpening this blade? If I get a blade that is dull, like this one here is dull, clear back here to this corner, you have to grind a long ways. If I'm going to maintain this straight line, and I'm going to grind until everything comes back square, you would end up taking off half of the life of this blade.
And then if you flip it over, you look where the bend is for the back tail.
So I'd have to grind all the way back to this point, so it'd be clear back to here. This much of the blade would have to go away in order to get this whole thing back to square. So you have to look at it and weigh several items. One, do I really have to be parallel? So the question is, can I actually grind this blade at a diagonal? Yes, you can. There's really no reason why I can't cut it back at a diagonal. You just want to make sure that you cut both of them exactly the same. You got to take the same amount of metal off of both sides. So if you were to cut this, because this is already down to a sharp edge, if you kind of cut it at a slight angle, you're not going to be taking as much metal off. You can get done faster. Or you look at it and think, if I'm going to grind that much, maybe I should just buy a new blade. If you're a dealer, you should be able to get the blades pretty cheap. When we order blades, we order them out of this, from our distributor. And our blades, like blade like this, is around $7 to $9. If you've got a shop rate of $90 an hour, and you can calculate, you can't spend very many minutes on this blade before you bought the customer a brand new blade that's fully there. All the metal is there, it's balanced, it's sharp, it's everything. And so you got to look at, what is my shop rate what is the customer paying me to do? What is the most cost-effective thing to do? So you got to weigh those factors.
The materials you use to sharpen the blade.
And how much material am I going to burn up?
You have to go through that much blade.
If I'm burning off a bunch of stone, then my stone is wearing out, my machine is wearing out, and I'm not even covering my costs, and I'm giving it back to my customer. And if I charge my customer $7 to sharpen his blade, and I could buy a brand new one for $7, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So you got to be careful. At the dealer level, most of the time they just put a blade on. So, or they're going to charge a low rate, and you better be able to sharpen a blade pretty fast. So you got to have a sharpening system that's fast. And so we're going to go look at some sharpening systems that are out there, talk about the benefits of them and how we can make some money with those. So we have some options there. You got to look at all these pieces. The other thing we want to look at is this back piece. This particular blade is called the gator blade. It cuts the grass and then it shreds the grass. So you got this leaf that's going to be standing up here. We cut it, and then this part shreds it and makes it smaller. It's going to
have to sharpen those.
You don't sharpen these. You never sharpen these ever. And so what you do want to do is inspect them. So this one, I'll pass it to you. But right here, the sand is starting to erode. So I'll stop moving. And right in here, this thing is starting to erode. And eventually, it'll actually start eroding all the way across. And it could actually break off. So you can get this chunk of metal to go off. This is very important when you're in areas that have lots of sand. So Walla Walla's got a lot of pretty decent dirt. If you go to Hermiston, you go to Tri-Cities where their normal soil is sand, you're grinding a lot of sand. This area back here wears away pretty fast. And so you'll be looking at that, and that's a case where, yeah, you might just put a new blade on every time and you might not be grinding very much. So
what are I've been told before that these gator blades, they're actually weaker than normal blades because they have such big groove spaces in them that this actually is a normal spot for it to start cracking through. Have you ever seen gator blades?
I've never met somebody or heard of any stories where the gator blade is actually wore or broke off because of this slot that's in here. I would surmise that if it did happen, it's probably because they ground the blade back so far that it was real thin, and then yes, I would think that, you know, you get thin metal, it could break faster. So if I were to grind this blade more than halfway back, it would become weak because it also would be wearing back here. So this would be getting thinner and this would be getting thinner, and then it could. That's just a case where they ran the blade too long. So other than that, I've not heard of anybody having that problem.
Would you recommend a gator blade over any other blade?
I would. So I actually ran a couple of experiments with leaves. We had those big sycamore leaves, and they're big, thick, heavy things. And I actually took a lawn tractor with 3 blades on it and a bagger, and I mowed 3 strips through the leaves and dumped the bags. Then I put gator blades on and went out and mowed 3 strips in there. And the bag actually had less leaves in it when I used the gator blade. So why did it have less leaves in it?
It was mulching it more.
So it did one of 2 things. I think it cut the leaves up smaller, so my bag was able to put more material in it. The second thing is it cut some of the leaves up small enough that they stayed on the ground. And so it's good for your soil to actually have the grass put back in. We tend to bag because it gets to be excessive, and then it creates thatch and it builds up and it looks bad and all that. So we want to collect the grass to make the appearance fine. But if we could chop it up fine enough that it was almost powder and let it dissolve into the soil, you'd be putting your nitrogen and water back into the soil, and that's really a good thing to do that. And so having a gator blade that mulches and puts part of that leaf material back on the soil, and then the excess goes into the bag, is actually better for your lawn.
Now, what about those thatching machines? I think they're called thatching machines, where you mow your lawn, and then after a while you use these machines, when you go back over it, it kind of brings up the...
If you've got heavy thatch, thatch is a layer of dead grass, and the grass is trying to grow through it, and it kind of suffocates it. It keeps the oxygen from getting down into the soil. And so a thatching machine is trying to get rid of that, raking that dead grass out of there, opening the soil up, letting it breathe more. And if you've got material, particular types of grasses that create a lot of heavy thatch, then a thatching machine that's taking that grass out is going to be good for it. And so that's not a normal thing that you do all the time.
Sometimes do that in areas that have heavy snow. In the spring, all that snow compacts the grass down into a really heavy thatch mat. And
it'll mat it down, and you're trying to get rid of that mat. You're trying to fluff it up so that the new grass can actually come up. So if it's matted from the snow, or if it's just matted because of maybe some traffic, it could be, it's usually just the type of material. Some grasses are so coarse they don't break down very fast, so they lay there and they become this layer of dead grass, and it doesn't look very good, and it harms affects the effect of the grass, how well it's growing. So we run a thatcher that goes through, and it's just basically stirring that dead grass up, bringing it up.
So golf courses don't use a thatching machines?
They used to use them a lot. They use verticutters, they use some thatching machines. A lot of what they do now is they dump sand on it. So they go and they top dress with sand, and they're covering up that thatch. Now the thatch is underneath, and it will break down faster. And so that's why you see a lot of sanding. So we'll just add material.
In Idaho Falls, where I grew up, they did that a lot.
The thatching or the sanding?
Both. We'd even core harvest.
So
fairways and grass.
So by coring, aerating, you're going through and punching holes in it. You're punching through that thatch. You're putting some sand in there. You're trying to open it up and get oxygen and get water to percolate down. So we have several methods of doing that. As a homeowner, we're probably not going to have an aerator in our garage, so that's probably not something we have, whereas a thatcher is a pretty simple device I can put on and go out and thatch.
I know where I live, my landlord every so often will have Cynthia come out and do either, not the thatching, but they'll aerate the lawn a little bit and then do the nutrients or whatever. But that's like once in a while. But
in doing that, they're just trying to soften the soil, let it breathe, and so it grows better. So there are blades that have a little hole in them, and there's a spring, little wire sticks down, and you can use a mower blade for thatching. So you use your same mower to do that stuff. So it sometimes can get pretty aggressive. So you just got to be careful and change your height and do that kind of stuff. So if you have a bagger, you tend to not have that thatch build up, so you eliminate it. But you're not putting the nitrogen in, so you have to put nitrogen on your grass to maintain your green grass. So you're trading off getting rid of your excess grass, but then you have to add fertilizer to substitute for it. So two different things. So I look at these as beneficial. They definitely, veterans used to run straight blades. They had some machines that ran. The first time they went to this style of blade, they commented that they always seen grass in their rough area. They mowed with a rotary mower in their rough area. They always seen grass on the surface. As soon as they put these blades on, they had no more grass on the surface. It cut it up fine enough that it actually filtered through the grass and disappeared. So their aftercut appearance at the golf course was impressive, and they're like, wow. The college itself, when I've converted everything on our campus to these gator blades, and they've noticed that there's less grass on the surface. So it definitely is going to cut it up finer, and finer grass is going to naturally filter through the soil or through the grass and get down in there and start to break down faster. So they're definitely worth it. And the price difference is sometimes $1. A couple of times I've seen where the gator blades were cheaper than the old standard blades. Usually they're between $1 and $3 more. So it's not that big a difference. It's pretty easy to sell a customer on it. So
And so in doing that, it would actually save you money on spending for fertilizer. You wouldn't have
Yes.
to buy as much and do it as often.
Long term, you're actually saving money because you're putting the fertilizer back in. So if I can leave some of that grass there and get it to break down, then I'm actually long term in better shape. I have less grass to dispose of. I'm putting more fertilizer in the ground, and I'm spending less money on fertilizer. Yes. So we'll talk a little more about that. So I want to make sure, always cut it. 30 degrees is the most common angle. If we start getting too much more than 30 degrees, it gets pretty weak. And if you hit a rock or something, it tends to chip out. If you get a blade and they've hit a rock or something and there's a chunk missing out, don't try to grind the whole blade to get rid of every single chunk, because most of the blade is going to be cut out here on the end, especially if that chunk missing is in towards the middle more. You'll actually do most of your cutting out here. So grind most of it. If you're down and you got one piece that's not there, as long as it's not hanging down, don't worry about it. Just move on, because you're just wasting metal. Every metal you take off is just shortening the life of that blade.
Don't you usually, if you have a chunk that's hanging down, don't you want to take a file to it first before you start?
I usually go and flatten the bottom surface.
Yeah.
So I'll take a file or something and I'll make sure that the bottom is flat and before I grind it. So you want to make sure nothing's hanging down. So just don't get in the habit of filing it. You want to lay it flat and file it. So yes. So and we'll give you another technique there. So the 30-degree angle, I want to maintain that 30-degree angle. I want to make sure that I don't do any notches, and I got to keep grinding until I get it back to that direction. The next thing is, when I sharpen it, do I sharpen it to a razor point or not? And if it's a customer, if I'm in the business where I have a lot of homeowners, I may actually leave it almost like a razor, depending on whether I think the customer is going to look at the blade or not, or interact with the blade, because homeowners think that it has to be a razor sharp knife in order to cut. And if it's not razor sharp, then you don't know what you're doing. But the reality is, if it's not razor sharp, what you really want, and when you look at a brand new blades are not razor sharp. They actually have a small flat spot right on the tip. And I don't really have that in the drawing. I kind of have it in the drawing here, where what I'll do is I'll sharpen it. If it's razor sharp, I'll take a flat file, lay it on there flat, and I will run it across it usually twice. And I'm looking for about a 20 thousandths flat spot. And by having that flat edge, it's actually going to be stronger. It'll maintain sharpness longer than if it was a razor sharp blade. So this particular blade that I have, one side comes to a point and one side has a flat spot in it. And when you look at it directly and the light hits it, you'll see a shiny area. And this one, when you look at it, there's no shiny area. It's because this one comes to a point. When you have a blade that's sharp, you can't see it. If it's dull, light reflects back and you can see it. So this blade is sharpened both ways. So, and I do that as my example blade. So if I'm working at the college, if I'm working at a golf course and I'm in charge of it, I would take and make a flat spot. If I'm in a consumer products and I'm worried about my customers interacting with it, in some cases I may leave it a razor blade, because it's easier to leave it as a razor than it is to go through and educate all of my customers on what a properly sharpened blade looks like. So if you're worried about certain customers, you might leave it as a razor. Just know it doesn't last as long. It'll dull faster. So
The same thing kind of applies to large chips blade. That if you don't go back all the way, sometimes some customers will get a little bit irritated about that, I found.
because it's got to look perfect. If you grind it at an angle, you don't know what you're doing, because the original blade was not ground at an angle. So you just got to look at that. But you got to look at time and money. If you got that kind of customer, maybe you just want to sell them a new blade. So you got to be weighing all those factors. When you're grinding this blade with a stone, the stone itself should always go up. The first point of contact with the stone should be the cutting point. So if I'm going to grind this blade, my stone should be traveling in this direction. If you travel this direction, I'm going to cut the piece of metal and drag the piece of metal across, and the hottest point will be down here at the tip, and I never want to get my tip to be too hot. If you're bluing, if you're grinding and it has a blue look to it, you're grinding it's too hot, you're too aggressive, and that's going to cause damage to the molecular structure of the metal, and it's going to weaken it, it's going to get dull faster. So you never want to get so hot that you can't put your hand on it. So that would be too hot. You got to be careful. Sometimes you'll see some streaks in it when you're grinding, and that could be that the paint. So the stone grabs the paint, smears it through, and sometimes that kind of looks like it's a burnt thing, but it's the rust or the dirt or the paint. So you'll learn to distinguish between them. So make sure that goes that direction. That's all the recommendations that are in here. So blade damage, rotary blade damage, you want to make sure they're not bent. So here I have an example of one that's real obvious. You're like, oh, that was pretty obvious. There's something wrong with that one. This is usually an indication something happened. They hit something pretty hard. And if it damaged that, you're going to want to look at the spindle. If this is on a rotary blade, a rotary engine, the engine's attached to it, look for damage to the rest of the engine, because something's going to be damaged besides just that blade. And so I'm looking for bent situations, so I'm laying it on the table and on the tips resting on the table. Straight blade, this is a correct condition where it's flat. This one here where it's actually tilted backwards, it should actually sit flat. And then look for cracks or wear. So we go through these. This particular blade here, the green blade, it's laying here on the table. This looks pretty flat. You look at this end, and this tip is pretty close to the table. It lifts up a little bit here, but this end down here, if I flip it around, you can see how this blade is way off the ground, and there's a chunk missing right on the very end. So this blade contacted something, took a chunk out of it, bent the tip of that blade up. So you'd want to replace that blade. So be careful, look at it carefully. Don't just assume, there's nothing wrong with them. So this one was bent. This one here is a mulching blade. So a standard mulcher. So it's designed to cut the grass, and then this area here is taller. So I've cut the grass, it bounces up, hits the mower deck, falls back down. As it's falling back down, this one's going to cut it again. So this was really what existed before gator blades existed. This was their way of mulching. So we either have two blades, one on top of each other. Honda has a lot of those where there's a blade on top of a blade, so they're cutting it and then they're cutting it again. And they're just trying to get the grass in a finer format before it hits the ground. So in this case, we're going to mulch it here, cut it, and then mulch it back here. So that's a mulching blade. This is just another example of a mulching blade. Here's a blade from the college where they actually cut it and it was 90 degrees, and I went in tried to put a little bit of a radius in it to alleviate some of that breakage. This one here is gotten to the point where we're nearly a third of this blade is gone, and so you're starting to get to that point where it's starting to get pretty thin, getting kind of weak. Do I really want to grind it? I'm looking at this. Somebody didn't grind this at 30 degrees. That's a pretty steep angle. So now when I go to cut the grass, I cut the grass, and then my blade is so steep that I'm dragging the blade with me. So I cut the grass blade, and then I'm dragging it with me instead of slicing and running off the blade. So if I get too steep, yes, it won't dull very fast, but then I'm actually dragging grass with me, and it's going to take more horsepower when you start going this steep angle. So too shallow, chips out, breaks out really fast, and too steep, takes a lot more horsepower. So this one I thought, well, if I try to grind it back, and I grind a little bit more off, I'm almost halfway across, let's just go to new blades. So we replace this blade. This particular blade here is the customers came in, we went to pull the blade off. This thing had a sail that stood up here almost 1.5 inches. So in the brand new blade when we got it, if I were to lay this on a piece of paper, this blade went out here and came over, and then it had a cell that was sticking up here 1.5 inches. And you can see not much left. So the question is, where did the cell go? You know that it ate itself off, because you can see it's like a razor blade here. It ate the cell off. The cell sticking up here, it ate it off down here. That cell broke off, and you got a blade that's turning 19,000 feet per second. It's traveling that speed. When it went off, do you think it just went, oh, I'm done?
Probably went down a mile down the road.
I mean, who knows where it went? Did the customer even notice this thing going out there? And when one blew off, that made it really unstable. This thing was putting a lot of vibration in the machine. It's probably damaging it until the other side decided to break off. And you can see it's even thinner. And so you take this off and you're like, wow. So, and this blade came from a student. He brought his lawnmower in to service his lawnmower, and this is what he found when he sifted it up. So it was funny.
Just hope he was bagging.
I don't know. I'm thinking even a bag, because if it's a bag, especially if it's a rear bag, it's going to go through the bag. There's nothing that's going to stop that. Even the side of the mower deck is going to dent the mower deck. So if it was side discharging, that plastic chute might deflect it down, but
It's still gonna go.
if it came out the bag, that'd be the worst, because there's nothing other than grass, and it would, if you had a full bag, maybe it would stop going through the grass before it took out your leg. So I'm just thinking, wow. So this is another one of those that's bent. You can see here we're touching the ground here. When I rotate it, this thing's tweaked up, and there's something wrong. So be careful, always look. And this blade, really I need to rotate it up so that this is flat. This thing's got some problems. So,
How do blades get bent down?
because they hit some solid object.
Yeah.
So
I've seen
Oh,
one.
okay.
I had a
I was thinking if it's like even just a little bit above the higher than the blade, it would go up and then just bend up rather than down.
if the blade stops on the object, it's because the blade is curved up, the blade's going to tip forward.
Is that just how they engineer it, design them?
It's just the way the the blade is designed with a sail on it to throw the grass out for bagging and discharge purposes. So just because they've designed it for that, that's going to cause them to bend and curve down.
Causes that to bend?
Yep.
Okay.
And these blades you see that are bent are all real thin blades, except for this guy. Whatever these guys hit, holy cow. I mean, this is a thick blade.
Industrial. Then.
It's,
So is there like a standard size that blades have to be now when they manufacture them?
no.
Can they just make them any thickness they feel?
They can make them any thickness that they want, and your cheap lawnmowers, your homeowner, Craftsman, MTD, just the Home Depot, box store, or Kmart, whatever, those guys are going to put a thin blade because it takes less horsepower to get that blade moving, and it's going to wear out faster, and they're in the market to sell you parts. And the less metal that's in the blade, the less cost they have involved. So they're going to make it as thin as possible to be safe.
That's why the mower only starts to begin with.
And they look at how many people have a mower that the mower dies before the first blade wears out. I mean, you just be amazed. You go to the landfill and look at these mowers that come in, and a bunch of them probably still have the original blade. The customer only mows a couple of hours a month. I mean, you only have a little side yard. It takes you 5-10 minutes to go out mow it, and they mow once a week. So in a month, they don't even get an hour. A lot of those people never change the oil, and they never change the blade. They run it until the oil runs out, because they didn't even know they were supposed to put oil in it. And so they just run it until all of a sudden it seizes, and they're like, oh, better go get a new one. Or they run them for 4 or 5 years, and like, we need a new lawnmower. It's like 5 years old, and they don't equate how much they use it to how long they've had it.
That customer that we had a couple of quarters ago, with the engine, the mower would die, you go out and get a new one. It'll die.
Got to know when he brought them all into us, and most of them they dirted out because there was no oil or the air filter was dirty, got dirt around it, and they did the same mistakes over and over, and they can't figure out why their mowers were running dead. So here's one that we looked at. It's very rounded here. We'd have to take a lot of metal off to get rid of the rounded, and the sail is starting to eat. There's like an area, and you look at the very tip. This tip right here is like thin, and we're starting to see a groove because it's actually wore so thin that this tip here is wearing out.
Doesn't even look like it's a blade for a mower.
So it is a blade for a blower, or a blade for a mower. And so, but it's pretty worn. So this one would go on the same one. This one here, you look at it and you think, what in the world? And you notice here we have a curve going in, and then you look at this side and it's not in. So why is that? What could you tell me about this blade? So you look at here, and I look at here how this one's curved.
That's how I sharpened it.
Could be a couple things. Either somebody sharpened it incorrectly, or there was a chunk that got taken out of one side as he kept sharpening and mowing, and sand had just smoothed it out over time.
So most likely, sand is going to affect it evenly on both sides. So sanding is going to affect, because you're not going to hit a sand, not sand, sand, not sand. It's always going to hit the same cell. It's going to be blasting, this thing spinning around. It's going to sand blast it the same. So sand will affect it virtually the same on both sides. And so you look at how thick this is. This didn't get thin and a chunk break off. So the only thing that could have happened with this blade was somebody ground it, and then somewhere they were doing this YouTube video thing, and then buddy told them that you're supposed to balance the blade, right? So if you balance it, you're supposed to grind something off the other end. So this side over here has been ground more than this side. So they ground some extra metal off over here to get it to balance out. But instead of grinding it like off the end, they ground it off of the cell. So they actually ground this piece here to take metal off to get it to balance. That is most likely what happened on this blade. And when you look at how they ground it, it's not an even grind, it's kind of goofy. And now I have a cell on this side that's throwing more grass than the cell on this side. It's just the weirdest blade. That's a case where you're like, let's just start fresh. So, yeah. So here's another blade, and these blades here, these are high lift blades. So if I don't have a bag, I'm just side discharging, then you typically have, a low sail in the back. If you're trying to do bagging, then I need to get more force. I need to really get that grass flinging out there, especially if I have a chute that has no power blower in it. And so the force of the sail has got to get it to go out, hit this plastic tube, get it to shoot up the tube, up over, through a curve, flip it around and dump it into a bag. You think the logistics of that is kind of crazy, especially if it's wet. And so they have to have a pretty healthy sail on them to get enough force to get it to do all that movement. And so these are high lift blades. And you can see that it's pretty healthy lift. So a high lift blade creates this area here where that's where in sandy areas this is going to erode. And you can see on this one how it's pretty thin, and the customer has ground all of the flat off up to the cell. So this one's been ground back quite a ways, and now I'm starting to erode this upper cell, and it definitely needs to be replaced.
Do you see these type of blades on more commercial style mowers than
You're going to see it on a riding lawnmower where they have 3 blades and a bagger. That's where you probably find that. So you get into the commercial ones, then you'll see more power blowers that are really getting the suction going, because those blades or those mowers in wet conditions sticks in the chute.
I don't even mean with one like the Jacobson rough mower.
Rough mowers aren't going to bag.
Well, no, I know, but
And I don't need that if I'm just side discharging or rear discharging. I'm not going to use a high lift blade. I'm only using a high lift blade if I'm bagging.
Oh, okay.
So so when you look in the catalog, and you'll have, standard, some other thing, and then a high lift. High lift would be for somebody who's bagging without any assistance, and they really want to discharge. So this was kind of a high lift. You can see here it's got a pretty steep sail on it, and it's designed to help throw the grass out. And again, it's starting to erode right here along this base. And so we looked at that, maybe we should replace it. This one here is not quite as aggressive as this one. So it has a little bit more of a flat spot on it, but it's the same blade as this one. It looks different because it's got the flat part on it before it got to the sail. So they have special blades. You go into this catalog, there's a lot of special blades. This is a spring blade. You only use this in the springtime. So they have spring, summer, fall one. This is a spring blade. Okay.
Now, why is it called a spring blade?
It's only used in the springtime, never in the summer.
Has nothing to do with the spring on it?
No. So you're going to find that blades come in, there's lots of debris wrapped around them, and so this one here came in, this is what we found. The most common thing to find is string. You get these farms or people with horses and stuff, and you get baling twine and it wraps around. What happens when I get baling twine wrapped around my blade? Or string, because they have like, a little, any kind of thing in the backyard for entertainment.
It can catch up inside the...
It gets pulled up inside the seal and it wipes out the seal. So you start getting strings and stuff wrapped around there. That string will bind up inside of there and it cuts the seals because it's really fine. And if you took a string and rub it on your hand, it'll cut your hand up pretty fast. So the string will actually cut the seals out. So you want to be careful and get the debris back off. So, and then this here is just a standard blade, and it's still pretty thick. There's really no reason why this one couldn't be resharpened and stuck back on. So, but this blade also is probably only about $4 or $5. So, do I sharpen it or do I not? So, those are the kind of things you want to weigh, want to be looking at. Is it worth fixing? Is it not worth fixing? Does the customer have the wrong blade? Can you go get the blade that you're going to sharpen over there? So, and then you want to maybe talk to the customer and find out if there's a different blade that might do...
1435?
There might be some blade that'll actually be a better situation for him. Maybe he's using this kind of a blade and he's trying to bag and his bagging is not working. He's complaining about it. He wants to change it. Or he's running a high lift blade and he's never bags. He bought the mower, he had a bagger, he immediately took the bagger off, but he's still running these high lift blades.
So if you put a high lift blade on it and you didn't have a bagger, wouldn't it just all start packing up underneath the deck?
It might actually pack up underneath the deck, but typically because it's throwing the grass out, it'll actually kind of somewhat clean the deck because it's actually forcing it out. So, but it's a more expensive blade. So he's spending extra money on some feature that he doesn't really need.
Yeah.
So you want to be careful about that. So we're going to sharpen these blades on our machine back there, and this is on a 1435 John Deere. So it's a commercial blade. You can see it's a pretty thick blade. It's got the gator. So up here we got our mulching features. It's got an extension. So one of the features is extended length. So this one's actually be cutting longer length to cut, so you can travel faster and it's going to be cutting more areas. And because it's kind of curved up, we're going to do a little bit of extra mulching, so we have a double mulching feature going on. And then on the bottom side you'll see that there's a flat strip here. This flat strip is actually a hard surface. It's like a carbide, sprayed on carbide, and it's harder than the top surface. So this blade is just mowing the grass. The top surface is wearing away, and the bottom surface is hard and it doesn't wear away. This blade will maintain sharpness longer because of the fact that we're not...
So technically it kind of sharpens itself.
It'll in some ways self-sharpen. And I haven't been able to get really great data from our grounds department, but from what I've been able to interpret from Chris, when we had this style of blade without the hard surface on it, he would pull the blades every single week and sharpen them so that they were pretty sharp. Because they would start to get round, and they get round, they would get dull, and it takes more horsepower. And so he sharpened every single week. When I switched him to the hard surface blades, he said he pulled them off every 3 weeks and sharpened them. I said, well, did they need it at 3 weeks? Well, no, but I just like to touch them up. So I don't know if he really needed to sharpen them at 3 weeks, or if he just did it because it was a habit. But he went from every week to at least every 3 weeks. So I look at it, if I spent $1 more, if I spent $5 more on a blade like this, if I could go from sharpening once a week to 3 weeks, just the labor, 2 weeks where the labor that I didn't have would pay that back really fast. And so that surface, that extra cost alone came back to us at the college just like that. So we paid for all that within the first month.
That also work as a purpose of the wear line, or how far back you can go before.
Once you get past that, then there's no benefits to having it. That's true. So, and if you look at it, if I wore that far back, if I come back to here, I'm getting pretty thin. It might be a wear indicator. I've never really used it as a wear indicator. Usually when it gets to that point, other things make me throw it away. And so it usually will wear to that point, and then by then this is starting to get worn, something else is getting worn, and I'd want to replace that blade. So these blades, they were never sharpened before. So these blades, we put them on that mower last spring, and they started using this mower probably in June, and they put 83 hours on it and never sharpened it. And they didn't have an extra set of blades. No, they do have one set extra blades. So this may not be the same blade for 83 hours. So I don't know that answer. But they put 83 hours on it, and when we got it, the tips got a little bit of ding going on here, but really, it's still good. So we're just experimenting with a grinding machine, so we're just going to kind of polish it up a little bit. We're not really going to do much for grinding on it.
So then, do they make blades like that with the carbide tip underneath for many machines? Or can you only get it for a solar?
It's not for everyone, but it is quite a few. So when you look in...
It's more for like the commercial use mowers?
No. I can get it for lawn and garden equipment. So when you look in this catalog has a section on blades. So this is blades. The blades start here, and the blades go clear to this point. So this is just mower blades in this catalog.
Wow.
So we got a lot of blades. So then the question is, what do you have? And then over here, when you look up this side, if it's red, it's a G6, and a G6 has the hard surface. So just looking at this page, all of these are hard surface blades. So there's a hard surface, there's a hard surface, these are hard surfaced, hard surface. So there's quite a few, but you can see like these blades, no hard surface. So this section here doesn't have a hard surface. This one doesn't have hard surface unless you get to here. So that is an option on quite a few blades. So here we have a whole series of blades. None of them are hard surfaced. So it just kind of depends on how many blades they sell, whether they would put that feature on, how many people buy them, whether they keep it on there. It's kind of a constant changing thing. So
you won't basically find them though on your push mowers compared to your...
Oh, you can get them on your push mowers too. So it just depends on, whether it's cost effective for them to create that blade or not. So, and when you look at it, we've got the standard blade, then you get a mulching blade, then you get into your gator blade. So there's various blades that you can put on there. So you got to figure out what's the best blade for the customer. And you want to price it. So I've gone down and actually priced out all 3 blades and then look at, you know, which one's cost effective. What's the customer going to do with it? Is he hitting a lot of rocks? Because if he's hitting a lot of rocks with that hard surface, you're going to start chunking out the hard surface. Kind of a waste of time. So if he's just going to go chunk the blade out with rocks, he may just buy the cheap blade and just constantly replace blades on him. So you don't automatically go to the most expensive blade is on every case. So you can weigh all those factors. Talk to the customer, find out what his needs are, what's working for him, how often is he going to sharpen it, is it only going to be when he brings it back to you next winter to service it that the blade's going to get sharpened. In that case, the hard surface would give him a better quality cut throughout the summer. He's probably going to be much happier. So it's pretty rare that I don't sell the customer the gator blade, just because I'm getting more material back in, and it's in the best interest of most of my customers to get that nitrogen back in the soil. And there's less material on top. Their aftercut appearance is going to look pretty decent. Bagging quality. This particular blade here, you'll see it has the serrations, and then there's a piece on the end that doesn't have the serration. This is supposed to be for the bagging purposes. And so this is a 3-in-1 or 4-in-1, and it's supposed to be a mulcher and a bagger. And so if I think he's going to maybe switch back and forth with the bag, I want to make sure I get the tip that's not serrated versus like this one where the tip is serrated to the end. So I
really,
might consider that.
Selling a customer gator blade, you're going beyond just making him happy with the service. You're saving him money on his lawn maintenance too.
Mm-hmm. And what you'll find is this, the technician, most people are going to listen to the technician more than they are going to be the salesperson, because we look at salespeople as they're just pushing something on you. And a technician's not selling you anything, but in reality is you are selling them something.
But the technician has the scientific facts to back.
He is more reliable. So you need to be educated on what's out there, know the facts, ask them the questions, know how to ask the questions, and then sell him what's best for him. Because if he doubts you, then your integrity for everything's gone. So you kind of have to know what the salespeople are doing, because you're the one that's putting those parts on there and you want to sell him. And the reality is, as a technician, you're selling a service, you're selling parts. The money in a dealership is made in selling of parts. That's where, it's not the sale of the new product, it's the sale of all the parts and accessories. So you actually make more money selling parts than anybody else in the whole store. And so knowing how to sell parts and how to do that and keep your integrity is going to be important. So you want to know what's worked. Don't, sell them fish oil. Now this isn't fish oil. These serrations really do their job. And that's why when I first experienced them, I took them out and did it. I went out, took a machine, and I mowed strips, and then I switched the blades, and I mowed strips, and I compared them. What did I see? So that I could talk to them from personal experience rather than, I read about, I read an article, there was a news thing, the sales guy, I went to a seminar where the factory was touting, the factory people, in some cases, if you get an engineer, maybe. If you get some of the training people, it's pretty decent. But sometimes you get people that are hired just to give a message, but they have no background. And you're like,
They're told what to say.
They're told what to say. They're reading the script, and you ask them any question off the script, and they're like, what do you think? Okay. They might be just doing it. It's a salary and it's a job, and 6 months later they're gone. So I don't like those people. So those are blades and just some of the things about blades. So hopefully that was helpful. So we'll go look at grinding methods. So we'll go to the tool room, welding room over there. We'll look at the grinders, and then we're going to go end up at our fancy grinder.
You guys didn't use
So
that machine
just hit
last-
pause.
The 1/4, did you? The one that's over here.